The 2025 Formula One season is upon us. Coming up, a massive preview of all 10 teams, all 20 drivers, a review of F175 Live, my own personal rankings of the liveries we'll see on the cars this year, and a few other quick thoughts on some of the news circulating the Formula One world as we head into the opening round in Australia. All coming up next on the first edition of the Chicanery Podcast. We've made it through the winter break. We've made it through preseason testing. For the first time in 2025, it is race week. But before we start seeing cars on track, at least for the first time in a competitive way this season, I thought it would be appropriate to start the season, start this podcast series with a review of all of the teams, all of the drivers, give some thoughts, predictions, analysis on what we think we'll expect to see from each this year, or at least what we should expect from each of the drivers and each of the teams this year. Starting at the top, though, at least according to last year's standings, McLaren. Can they repeat as Constructors' champions? But more importantly, to a lot of people within the team and a lot of people outside of the team, can one of their drivers bring home their first Drivers' Championship, which would be the first for the team since Lewis Hamilton in 2008? Everything that we've seen, and of course it's early, but everything that we've seen from their shakedown at Silverstone, the reveal at F175 Live, and of course more pictures that came out after that, and the preseason testing, everything is pointing to McLaren being the team to beat, at least going into this season. Now, a lot of that can change. If we look back at last year, Red Bull starts the opening rounds and the opening races. They look like the team to beat. They look like it's going to be a repeat of 2023 where they're winning almost every single race. It's not competitive. They're going to run away with it again. Fast forward to Miami of last year, all of that changes. So there is a chance, even though McLaren has this advantage to start the season from what it looks like, there's a chance that teams can catch up. Ferrari's in a good spot. Mercedes is in a good spot. Red Bull's in a good spot. But one change with this year that wasn't present last year is we have a change in the regulations coming in 2026. So a lot of these teams, last year they had the entire season to make changes, develop the car, try to figure out what they can to catch up to McLaren. This year is different. This year, if teams haven't already, they have probably about till midway through the season before they're going to be forced to switch to 2026 and shift their focus towards the new regulations. So there isn't a lot of time for teams to catch up like there was last year. So another thing that's working in McLaren's favor, but all of the reports, all of the comments coming from McLaren and coming from other teams that aren't named McLaren suggest that this is the team to beat and this is the car to beat going into this season. What have we seen, though, on this year's MCL 39, this year's version of the McLaren? They've taken a bold approach. You would think that a team that is coming off a season with so much success, coming off a season where they had such a dominant car, they wouldn't change a lot. But one thing that did happen with McLaren is we saw a dip towards the end of the season. And we did see Ferrari catch up. We saw Mercedes catch up a little bit. We saw Red Bull catch up a little bit. So McLaren had to do something different. They had to make some changes, some drastic changes, catch their rivals off guard, and regain that advantage that they enjoyed so much last season. And it looks like they've done that based on the changes that we've seen on the car so far. Some of the main differences, the front suspension looks like it's totally different. Specifically the wishbone configuration, which if you're not familiar with that, those are the bars that run in between the tires and the chassis of the vehicle. Those have been reworked in a way that a lot of people think will help with the car's anti-dive. Which basically means when the car goes into a corner, when the driver hits the brakes, the car doesn't dive down. And when the car does dive down, it hurts with the speed of the car, it hurts with the efficiency of the car, and ultimately the overall performance of the car. And this was something that McLaren struggled with last year. This was a team that was very good in the high-speed corners, very good in the medium-speed corners, not great in the low-speed corners. So if they had this figured out, certainly will be something that works in their favor and will help them regain that advantage that they had last year. Some other bodywork on the car is a little different too. The side pods are a little different in shape, look a little bit skinnier and more of a gap underneath the side pods, which is a trend that we're seeing with a lot of teams this year. The McLaren, their side pod intake looks like it's been changed to a P shape. Another thing that we've seen on a lot of cars, so probably McLaren trying to steal little bits and pieces from the rivals and try to maximize their car as best as they can. Another noticeable change is the airbox, which is sitting above the driver's head. That's more of an egg shape now instead of a circular shape. So a lot of changes to the body of the car and a lot of changes that should improve aerodynamic efficiency, which was the focus of this team going into the winter break and heading into this season, and something that Andrea Stella admitted as, hey, this is what we're focused on trying to change going into this season. But everything that we have seen shows that this car is well ahead of its rivals. They said to have gained half a second in the winter testing. Of course, these are reports that are coming out of McLaren, so you take that with a grain of salt. And you do the same with preseason testing too. You can learn some things from preseason testing, but it's not a race weekend. These teams aren't coming with their full packages. They're not setting up the cars as best as they can. It's a 3-day period for these teams to tweak with the cars and experiment with the cars to try to find the best working window for these cars. So McLaren did look like the best car coming out of preseason testing, but that doesn't necessarily mean we saw the full performance out of Ferrari, the full performance out of Mercedes, the full performance out of Red Bull. But we might not have seen the full performance out of McLaren either. So something to keep in mind, but everything is looking good for this team heading into Australia. The biggest question that McLaren might have this year is the FIA technical directive on flexi-wings. This is something that started with McLaren last year, actually. So tracing it all the way back, going back to Baku, of course, this was a dominant win for Oscar Piastri. He, made an incredible move on Charles Leclerc to take the lead and really ran away with that wing. But one thing that came out from that race was some footage of the rear wing of the McLaren as it's going down the straight, as it's out of the DRS zone. You see some flexibility on that wing. And this was something that raised some alarms with the other teams. Ferrari, Red Bull, I believe Mercedes too, went to the FIA afterwards and said, hey, what's going on here? Is this allowed? Is this within the regulations? We need a ruling from you guys. And at that point, McLaren came to an agreement with the FIA that they would remove the rear wing that they were using. When teams do that, the writing's on the wall. They know what they're doing isn't allowed, and it's just kind of their way to do some damage control and get ahead of the story. So it looked like McLaren was probably using an illegal wing back then. But the important thing with that is after they came to that agreement with McLaren, the other teams, their rivals, went to the FIA and said, all right, what are things going to change going into next season? Are the regulations with the rear wings going to change? Are the tests that you perform on the rear wings going to change, or is everything going to stay the same? And the FIA at that point said, no, everything's staying the same. We're not going to change a thing. So teams relied on that. They went into the winter. They tried to develop their cars and design their cars to exploit this wing flexibility, thinking that the FIA wasn't going to change any of the regulations. Fast forward to January of this year, the FIA says, well, actually, no, we are going to change some things. We are going to make it the standards more strict as far as the wing flexibility is concerned. So what have they changed with the new regulations? Basically, both wings, the front wing and the rear wing, are allowed some flexibility. The FIA has reduced that flexibility by a third, according to last year's regulations. So with the rear wing, I believe it was allowed to flex up to 15 millimeters. Now it can only flex up to 10 millimeters. Front wing could flex, I believe, 3 millimeters. Now it can only flex 2 millimeters. So very, very fine changes and small changes to these regulations. But for a car that relies so much on aerodynamic efficiency and can be affected by these small changes, it could mean a lot. But really a big question, not only for McLaren, but for a lot of these teams, is how are they going to navigate these new regulations with wing flexibility? With the rear wings, it's starting immediately in Australia, but with the front wings, the new regulations and new standards don't start until round 9 in Barcelona. So teams do have a little bit of time to try to figure this out and try to correct this. But again, going to the regulation changes, this is something that puts us close to the midpoint season. They really don't have a lot of time to change this because of their focus shifting to 2026 and the new cars and the new regulations. So definitely something to watch out for, and something that McLaren doesn't think it will affect them too much, but it should realistically affect all of these teams. But one thing that is working in McLaren's favor, we know about the big players with this team. We know about Lando Norris. We know about Oscar Piastri. We know about Zach Brown. We know about Andrea Stella. But one name to watch out for with this team this year is Rob Marshall. Um, he came over in 2024 from Red Bull, worked at Red Bull from 2005 to 2023. He was crucial in the car's development and the car's design, and specifically exploiting wing flexibility. He's been credited by Andrea Stella, or excuse me, not Andrea Stella, Adrian Newey. He's been credited by Christian Horner. He's been credited by a lot of people at Red Bull as a person who was crucial in their car design and crucial in exploiting wing flexibility. And we saw this immediately with McLaren. He comes over last year. Of course, the car they start the season with isn't a car that he had a lot of influence on, but we saw his influence with those first upgrades. And when they brought that first package to Miami, all of a sudden this team is competitive and winning races. And that's something that continued throughout the year. So even with these changes, Rob Marshall, he's head of the technical program with McLaren. This will be his first year where he actually designs the car in full heading into the season. He has the resume to tell you he's got it figured out, and he'll be able to navigate these new regulations, navigate these changes, and further exploit the wing flexibility on the McLaren. Now, this wasn't the end of it with the January announcement from the FIA, because we go to preseason testing, and all of a sudden a picture comes out of the McLaren rear wing, and you see based on the paint on the wing that they might still be using a mini DRS system. So of course the rivals go to the FIA again, send these pictures in, say, hey, what's going on here? Are they doing this again? And the FIA came out pretty quickly and said, this isn't allowed. We're cracking down on this right away. So one thing, as strong as McLaren looked in preseason testing, one thing to watch is, will this other change on top of the already existing changes further affect McLaren and further cut down on the advantage it looks like they have? But all in all, this is a team that's in a very good spot. If they have to figure this out, if they have to make some changes and they do fall back, they've proven they know how to develop this car, and they have the people in the facility who know how to work around these regulations and work around maximizing this car as best as they can. Another big question, though, for McLaren, as it was in 2024, who is the number one driver for this team? Now, of course, we know apparently no one is the number one driver. They're both the number one driver under Papaya rules, but we saw last year, and we've seen it with other teams, you have to designate a number one driver at some point. The only situation that this team could get away with it this year is if McLaren is just so far ahead of their competitors and so far ahead of the field that they can afford to let Lando and Oscar fight. And if they crash into each other or something bad happens, it's not the end of the world, and it's not going to hurt either the drivers' championship. It's not going to hurt the constructors' championship. But really, that's the only circumstance you can see where this team doesn't designate one of these drivers as the number one driver. Now, last year, we saw this team let these drivers fight. I expect that's probably going to happen again this year. They're going to let, at least for the beginning of the season, Oscar and Lando really fight it out. No direction from the team, no Papaya rules from the team, nothing. And we'll just let these drivers hash it out on the track. So who will be in the better position at that point? If it comes to a point where Ferrari's on their tails, Mercedes is on their tails, Red Bull's on their tails, and they have to prioritize one of those drivers, who is it going to be? Now, you would think, and a lot of people do think this, that Oscar, even though Lando has the advantage with the results, Oscar's the better talent. Oscar has more potential. And you would think Oscar, going from his second season in Formula One to his third season in Formula One, would probably have more of a jump than Lando going from his sixth season to his seventh season. Oscar, he's a special talent. You see things from him that you only see from a Lewis Hamilton or a Max Verstappen or a Michael Schumacher. For example, his pass on Lando in Monza last year, it was something that's instinctive that you just sit back and you say, he's got it. You saw it again with his move on Leclerc in Baku, that dive bomb into turn one. Another move that's just it shows his aggression as a driver. It shows his potential as a driver, and just a special skill set that only certain amount of drivers have. And Oscar looks like he has that. But looking at the race results, there's a clear distinction between Lando and Oscar. Now, of course, Oscar came in 2023. It was his rookie season. He was coming off a season in 2022 where he was a reserve driver, was not on track on a consistent basis like Lando was. And certainly the experience in F1, it does go a long way. But at the end of the day, Lando's 25, Oscar's 23. There's a year and a half difference between the two of them. Granted, there is a difference in F1 experience, but these drivers really aren't that far off in age, which is something a lot of people gloss over when looking at who has more potential out of these two drivers. But looking at the race results and qualifying results and all of their performances against each other over the past 2 years, things heavily favor Lando. In 2023, Lando finishes the season with 205 points to Oscar's 97. Lando has 7 podiums. Oscar has 2. Lando has the advantage in race results 17-5 over Oscar. Lando has the advantage in qualifying results 15-7 over Oscar. Lando has the advantage in sprint races 5-1 over Oscar. 2024, Lando finishes the season with 374 points, 4 race wins, 13 podiums. Oscar finishes the season with 292 points, 2 race wins, 8 podiums. Lando again has the advantage in race results 16-8. He again has the advantage in qualifying results 20-4. So overall, looking at the point differential, it favors Lando 579 to Oscar's 389. Lando's got 4 wins to Oscar's 2. He has 20 podiums to Oscar's 10. He has the overall race result advantage 33-13 over Oscar. He has the qualifying advantage 35-11 over Oscar. And just to keep this in mind, and I'm not saying Oscar Piastri is Daniel Ricciardo. I think he's going to be much better than Daniel Ricciardo, as good as Daniel was. But those 2 seasons that Lando was with Daniel, he had the race advantage 31-12 over Daniel. He had the qualifying advantage 35-9 over Daniel. Not a lot of difference between Ricciardo's performance in the 2 years with McLaren and Oscar's performance with the 2 years with McLaren. So again, Oscar does have this special talent and this special ability that really makes you say, wow, this guy, he could be a future world champion, maybe a multiple-time world champion. But what we have seen on track, everything favors Lando. And I do expect Oscar to we're going to see more improvement out of him this year than we will see out of Lando, I think. But will it close that gap? I don't think so. I think we'll still see the best season we've seen out of Oscar. I think we'll see more race wins. We'll see more podiums. We'll see more points. But I don't think he's going to have the advantage over Lando. And I think Lando will probably, over the course of a season, still hold that advantage. And if it gets to a situation like it did last year, where this team has to make a priority call and designate one of these drivers as the number 1 driver, I think Lando's going to be in the best spot for that. And I think that's why a lot of people not only see McLaren's as favorites to win the Constructors' Championship, but see Lando as the favorite to win the Drivers' Championship this year. But this team, you would rather be McLaren than any other team on the grid. There's no doubt about that. And both of these drivers, I think, will have very strong seasons. And both of these drivers, even my thoughts on Lando, wouldn't be surprised if Oscar ends up as the Drivers' Champion for 2025. But both of these drivers and this car are in a very, very good spot heading into this season. All right, moving down the standings to Ferrari. Probably the most anticipated season we've had for Ferrari in a very long time. Probably the most excitement heading into the season as far as championship hopes are concerned since 2018, when Sebastian Vettel looked like he had a really good chance to dethrone Lewis. But the biggest reason why there's so much excitement for Ferrari going into the season is because of that man, Lewis Hamilton. Spent 12 years at Mercedes, won 6 championships, almost said 7 there, but 6 championships. Of course, all the Constructors' Championships that came with it. The biggest name in this sport. And a lot of people consider the greatest driver of this sport, heading to what a lot of people consider the greatest team of this sport. So just a match made in heaven for this for this fan base, and they're excited. You can tell. I cannot wait to see Imola, but more so Monza. But just the Italian fans just cheering on Lewis, cheering on Charles, and really having a team behind them that they're very excited about. But like McLaren, who's the number one driver for this team? Now you would think that with Charles being there as long as he has, and Lewis Hamilton coming in, having the resume that he has, they're going to let these two drivers fight equally. And I think Charles is probably going to have the edge to start the season. And not saying, he's a better driver than Lewis at this point, but he's been with this team for so long. He's been with the team for 6 years now. He knows the car. He knows the team. He knows how to communicate. He knows how to voice his concerns. He knows how to develop the car. He knows about the setup of the car. He's just more familiar in the spot than Lewis is, who's coming over from a team that he's been with for 12 years. There's a big learning curve for Lewis. But on top of that, too, Lewis going into his 40s, the fight's against Father Time. Every driver in every racing series will tell you that as you age, the first thing that goes are your reflexes, which can be the most important asset or most important attribute that you have as a race driver. So Lewis, as rejuvenated as he is, as excited as he is to start this journey with Ferrari, that's something that he's going to have to overcome, is fighting against Father Time and fighting against losing those reflexes and losing that instinctive nature that he's relied on for so long. Looking at these two drivers, and of course, leading up to this, we've never seen them in the same machinery. Lewis has been in a Mercedes. Charles has been in a Ferrari, other than that one season with Alfa Romeo. But what we have seen over the past 2 seasons, the Ferrari and Mercedes have been pretty close on track. So there is, it's not a direct comparison, but you still can compare a little bit between the two drivers and the results. Just going through it quickly, 2024, Charles had the edge, 356 points to Lewis's 223. 2023, Lewis has the edge over Charles, 234 to 206. 2022, it goes back to Charles, 308 to Lewis's 240. And then after that, we get into the Mercedes dominance years, and when Ferrari was still figuring out, so we won't go too much into that. But the past 3 seasons, these two drivers have traded back and forth as to who has the advantage in their cars. And I think that shows how close they are on track, and how close they are in talent. And as great as Lewis is, Charles is a special talent. He hasn't had the car to really fight for a driver's championship or even a constructor's championship, other than last year. But nobody doubts that Charles is a special talent and would be fully capable of winning championships if he had the car behind him. So for the first time, the good thing about this is we get to see these two drivers in the same machinery. But one thing for this team to watch out for, and it's a problem that McLaren obviously learned last year, is if they let it hang on too long and they don't assign number one driver status, they might have to at some point. If we get to a situation where Charles is way ahead of Lewis in the standings and Charles has a chance to fight for the driver's championship, or Ferrari has a chance to fight for the constructor's championship if they play their cards right, we might have to see this team make the same decision McLaren did, where they fight it and they fight it and they fight it, but at a certain point, they're going to have to pick one. And who will that be? I think Charles will be in a better spot. I think Lewis will, even with a slow start that I expect, will still catch up, still make improvements, probably win some races this year. But you would have to like Charles being in that position to be the number one driver if it came to it. But can you imagine telling Lewis Hamilton in his first season at Ferrari, hey, you're the number 2 driver now? Something that won't go over well, and definitely something to watch for this team. But regardless, another strong car. They had more concerns coming out of preseason testing than a few other of the top teams, but the Ferrari looks strong. The Ferrari looks competitive, and they might have to bring some upgrades and develop the car to fully get it to that point where they can compete with McLaren. But both of these drivers look like they're in a very good spot to compete. And it will be exciting to see these two, both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, in the same machinery, in a Ferrari, duking it out, figuring out who really is the better driver at the end of the day. But what do we know about this machinery? The 2025 Ferrari, like McLaren, they're going with a completely different approach to their car as well. Luke Serra has begun as the team's new technical director, so a lot of changes coming there. And Fred Vasseur warned us about this going into the season, saying, hey, this Ferrari is going to be 99% different than last year's car. And we've seen that. Their front suspension, like McLaren, is completely different. They've gone from a push rod to a pull rod suspension, so something that they believe will help with basically tire degradation and the car's overall performance. Their rear wing has been changed a little bit. Their front wing has been changed a little bit. The side pods have been changed a little bit. So a lot of major changes that we've seen on the Ferrari for this year's car. And the team's hopeful that it's going to suit both drivers' driving styles. But something that could be risky for this team. Charles likes a car with more oversteer. Lewis typically likes a car with more understeer. It's hard to imagine you design a car that fits both of those styles. So it's certainly reasonable to think that at a certain point, the way the car is designed is probably going to suit one of these drivers a little bit better. But we'll see once that car actually gets on track how it looks and which of those driving styles it prefers. Coming out of preseason testing, though, there were, before preseason testing, there were reports that Ferrari gained almost half a second from the improvements that they made in the winter, and they had a strong preseason testing as well. It sounds like they are still trying to figure out some things with the car, find the ideal operating window for the car, and hopefully that's not a touchy area like it was with Red Bull and Mercedes last year, where we saw it plague them from race to race, where one race they had it figured out, the next race they didn't. So hopefully Ferrari, for Ferrari fans and for both of these drivers and for the team, are able to figure out a much wider operating window. But there were reports that was a concern coming out of preseason testing. So definitely something to watch out for with this team. But overall, Ferrari looks strong. I believe they're going to be in a good spot. I think they're going to be able to develop this car before they switch their focus to 2026 and really compete with McLaren, at least McLaren, for the Drivers' Championship, for the Constructors' Championship. But they have some problems to figure out. And like I was saying before, one of the biggest problems they have to figure out is the driver priority. And that'll be a very, very interesting thing to watch as we head into the season as to who has the advantage early on, where the advantage looks as the season progresses, and ultimately, will this team have to make a tough decision as to giving one of those drivers priority? But you have to be excited if you're a Ferrari fan. The team looks much better than they have in years past, and really looks like they're able to put up a fight this year. Going to the third place team from last year, Red Bull. Can Max Verstappen make it 5 drivers' championships in a row, which would tie the record with Michael Schumacher for most consecutive titles? But for the first time since 2021, Max is not going into the season as the favorite to win the Drivers' Championship. Now, we saw the decline after Spain last year, something that was very foreign to a lot of Formula One fans. Max Verstappen going 11 races without winning, something that hadn't happened since 2020. But again, they did make improvements to the car. Of course, we saw the brilliance of Max Verstappen, which is just undeniable. But they did come back at the end of the season, turn this car into a race-winning car, and upgraded the car and made improvements to the car that made it competitive again. But the biggest question for Red Bull is whether they corrected those issues and got the development of this car truly back on track, or whether that was just a patch to make things look good for the end of the season. One of the biggest problems that that Red Bull has had is their correlation between their simulator and the wind tunnel and what they see on track. It was something that created a huge number of problems for them last year, where the simulator and the wind tunnel was telling them one thing, they get on track and it's totally different. Now, of course, Red Bull, coming off the dominance that they had and the new regulations that the FIA has on wind tunnel testing time, they were at a disadvantage. They were at the top of the standings. They had the least amount of time in the simulator, the least amount of time on the wind tunnel. So with them finishing in third place this year, they're going to get, or third place last year, they're getting more time in the wind tunnel. They're getting more time in the simulator. So hopefully for this team, that gives them the opportunity to correct those correlation issues. Um, but really, a big problem for this team outside of those correlation issues was just the car stability and the predictability and being able to be not only dominant, but just competitive from track to track. So something that we'll have to keep an eye on as the season starts to see if Red Bull really actually fixed those issues and have made the changes they need to going into this year. It doesn't sound great coming out of testing from this team. Uh, they do expect to still be close to the top four and within the top four between Mercedes, McLaren, and Ferrari. But even Max honestly admitted, coming out of preseason testing, hey, we're probably not going to win in Australia. So you wonder how frustrating of a season it's going to be for Max. We've seen it plenty of times with him throughout his career, but we saw it last year when he was in the lead for the Drivers' Championship, when they were in the lead for the Constructors' Championship, and he's not winning races. Of course, the pressure was building at that point, but we still saw a very cranky Max Verstappen when things didn't go his way, and a very whiny Max Verstappen. So you have to wonder if they start off the season slow, if he's not even competing for race wins, what are those radio messages going to be like coming from Max that we see on the TV broadcast? But, again, Red Bull, even though they might not be too far off, they're still in a good chance to correct those issues and possibly get this car in a working window and get it competitive for 2025. But again, like all of these teams, how much time can they spend trying to correct these issues and trying to perfect this 2025 car before they move to 2026 and shift that focus to next year? But what do we know about the changes that they've made to the RB21? Now, of course, we haven't seen the floor, and there's a lot that can change with the car that can't be seen with the naked eye. But this year's Red Bull looks a lot similar to last year's Red Bull, which is probably something that's a little bit concerning if you're a Red Bull fan. The most concerning part, though, is the main changes that we have seen appear to have come with the wings, both the rear wing and the front wing, and the wing's flexibility, which makes a lot of sense because Red Bull was the most vocal about their displeasure with the FIA's technical directive that came out in January, saying, hey, this is screwing teams over. You're catching us off guard. We've dumped all of these resources into these wings thinking that the regulations were going to stay the same. Now you're telling us they're different. So again, when it comes to the front wing, Red Bull won't have to actually make any changes until round 9 in Barcelona, but they're going to have to make some changes to prepare for after round 9 when those changes kick in. So, you definitely understand looking at the Red Bull car this year, looking at where the resources went to, and the wing flexibility that they highlighted so much in their development, you can understand why this team's a little upset and why this team's scrambling a little bit and isn't as hopeful going into the season as they had been in the past. And on top of that, too, they do have to make sure they have a good car for 2026. We saw a pretty unhappy Max Verstappen last year at certain times, and he still won the Drivers' Championship. They didn't win the Constructors' Championship, but he still got another fourth Drivers' Championship to his name. So in a season, if they're not winning, if he's not competitive, if he's not looking at a Drivers' Championship, how unhappy is he going to be? And then the regulations change in 2026. There's pressure on this team to perfect those regulations, knowing that we might have an unhappy Max Verstappen in 2025. We go into the new regulations and our car's not good for those either. We might have a very unhappy Max Verstappen. So unhappy he might leave. And maybe he goes to a different team. Maybe he leaves the sport altogether. But the pressure is definitely on Red Bull to get this right from the Max Verstappen camp. But you also have to wonder how Red Bull has even gotten to this point and lost their way. This was a car and a team that they had the most dominant car and driver that we've ever seen in the sport in 2023. And we started to see the decline a little bit from the team. Maybe not a decline from Red Bull at that point at the end of 2023, but teams started to catch up. And then we saw more of this in 2024 where they just started to fall off and fall off and fall off. And what was surprising for a lot of people is a lot of big names started to leave the team. And a lot of important names started to leave the team. And the biggest of those was Adrian Newey, who made some interesting comments about the dip in performance that we saw from Red Bull. He admitted it started at the end of 2023. That car became very difficult to drive. That's why Checo really began to struggle. Max still had the talent and the abilities to get by and correct those deficits and overcome those deficits and still win races. But even Max couldn't stop it in 2024, and that car became difficult for him to drive. And what was interesting is it looks like Adrian Newey made this known to some Red Bull staff back in 2023 of, we're going in the wrong direction and we got to change something before this gets too bad. And it sounds like a lot of people brushed him off. And it sounds like this might have been part of the reason why he ended up leaving the team, which is just mind-blowing that you would have Adrian Newey in your building, a guy with his resume who has designed so many cars since the 80s in this sport and has won so many championships with so many different drivers, that you would have him in this building saying, hey, we've got problems, and you don't listen to him. It's just, it blows your mind that Red Bull would have that type of arrogance and just be overly confident like that, where they wouldn't even pay him the time of day to listen to these issues. So that's probably how Red Bull has ended up in this spot, is they stopped listening to the important people. The important people started leaving, and this is where they are now. But this is a team that still has a very good track record, very good resume. Those people in the building were still part of the team when they were winning championships. So they do have the potential and ability to figure this out. But things are looking down for Red Bull, which is a very surprising thing to say coming off the last few years that we've seen this team and Max Verstappen be so dominant. Now, the other question for Max, too, is how the other drivers are going to race against him this year. I think we will see a more aggressive Lando this year coming off of their battles that they had last year. But the bigger question is, will Lando and Max even be close on track to have those battles anymore? Last year the two cars were pretty close in performance, but the way things are looking and the way that reports are coming out, it looks like McLaren might be a little bit ahead of Red Bull, and we might not even have to worry about Max and Lando really battling it this year like we saw last year. I think a much more closer fight will be between Max and George Russell, who we know all about their beef and all about the problems they've had with each other coming off the last year. Of course, both drivers have said they've lost respect for each other. Now, they've had, months to calm down for this. I don't know exactly where the relationship is now. But I would not be surprised, especially you have George Russell, who's taking the reins of this Mercedes team. He's no longer in Lewis's shadow. He's the senior driver. He's without a doubt the number one driver. You have a teammate in Kimi Antonelli, who's very young, very inexperienced. We know George Russell can be confident. I think we see a lot of battles, if any, between Max and George Russell this year. But regardless, if it's not George, I think a lot of drivers from last year watched Max and Lando go at it, watched at times George and Max go at it, and realized you've got to play tough with Max. He's going to, you don't want to say he's dirty, but he's towing that line. He's getting as close as he can to the edge and pushing that to the edge. And I think a lot of drivers are realizing, hey, that's what we've got to do. And if we crash with him, we crash with him. But if we want to get past him on track, that's the driving style that we have to have. And another thing with Max, too, when he's winning races, everything's great. The radio messages are nice and sweet. He's driving, perfectly. But when things start to go wrong and that car is not what it is, we start seeing some crazy moves from Max Verstappen. And definitely something that we've seen before with him crashing into drivers, just losing his emotions and making spur-of-the-moment decisions that just end up backfiring on him. So will we see that Max come out yet again this season? But there's another side of this garage too, and that's Liam Lawson. Now we know from the past, it's a tall order to be Max Verstappen's teammate, especially when the team has championship expectations. We've heard from his former teammates, specifically Alex Albon. I know has talked about this a lot, where Max likes a very, very twitchy car. When he turns the steering wheel just a little bit, he wants the car to react. And a lot of drivers don't. It's just not their driving style. They don't want a car that's twitchy, and that's been a big problem for a lot of his teammates, where it just takes so much to adjust to Max's driving style. And of course, Max is the number one. He's the better driver. The team is going to set up the car how he wants. The team is going to listen to him when it comes to that type of direction. So it's something that Liam is going to have to adjust to. And he's been with the Red Bull family for long enough. He's driven in this car in free practice. He's done testing. He knows how it drives. He has that type of experience to be able to handle this. But it's been a hurdle for a lot of drivers. And not everybody likes that setup style like Max Verstappen likes. So definitely will be probably the biggest hurdle for Liam Lawson to overcome heading into the season. But what have we seen from Liam Lawson so far to give us some indication of what his performance will be like this season? We haven't seen a whole lot. He does have some F1 experience, which is different. I guess you wouldn't consider him a rookie because of that experience, but he's at least going into his first full season. But we saw him in 5 races in 2023. He ended up securing 2 championship points. His highest finish was P9 in Singapore. He raced in 1 sprint race in Qatar, spun off, retired in P20. So not a lot there that looks promising. 2024, he raced in 6 races in F1. He accumulated 4 championship points. Again, his highest finish was 9th in Austin and also in Brazil. He had 3 sprint races in 2024, finishing P16 in Austin, P9 in Brazil, and P16 in Qatar. Before Formula One, going through his resume, 2023, he was a reserve driver for Red Bull and AlphaTauri. He also competed in Super Formula, finished up as runner-up in that series. The year before, in 2022, he spent in Formula 2, finished 3rd place in the standings. 2021, he was still in Formula 2, finished 9th place in the standings. 2020, he's in Formula 3, 5th place in the standings. In 2019, he's in Formula 3 and finishes 11th place in the standings. So, not the results you would expect for someone as highly touted as they are from a team from Red Bull. You expect, looking at those lower series, that they're competing for, they're at least finishing in 2nd for the Drivers' Championships, if not winning the Drivers' Championships. So, the highest that he finished in the lower ranks was 3rd place in 2022 in F2. And that was a long time ago. And an important thing for Liam Lawson, he does have the experience of 11 races and 4 sprint races over the past 2 years. He just hasn't raced a lot. And that's something that will certainly be a learning curve for him, of really getting into the swing of an F1 schedule, going from race weekend to race weekend over the course of a season. How is he going to be able to handle that? But you also have to wonder, too, if this team finds himself in a competitive spot, if they are competing for a Constructors' Championship, if they're in contention for a Drivers' Championship, how much pressure are we going to see on Liam Lawson if he's not producing? This is a cutthroat team with Red Bull. We've seen it with Pierre Gasly. We've seen it with Alex Albon. We've seen it with Daniel Kvyat. We've seen it with so many drivers. We've seen it with Checo recently, where if you don't put up the results, Helmut Marko goes running to the media and he starts making those comments and really putting the pressure on you. If Liam doesn't perform, how soon are we going to start hearing those comments? And how much is that pressure going to grow on Liam to really produce results? Now, if they're not competitive, if Max is sitting 5th in the standings, if they're sitting 3rd in the standings, and they really don't have a shot at competing for either championship, it's probably a better situation for Liam. And it's probably going to make things a little bit easier for Liam. But you have to wonder, if this team is competitive, or even if they're close to being competitive, how hot is that seat going to get for Liam Lawson? Overall, though, you really have to wonder if Red Bull will be competing for a championship this year. I think we're going to see some special moments from Max where his brilliance will be on display. similar to what we saw in Brazil of last year, where he's just, it blows your mind watching what he's doing on track and just, how much he can extract from a car. Um, but it's hard to imagine this team being in the situation that they were the past few years, where they're at the top, everybody's chasing them. For the first time, I think we're really going to see them start playing catch up. And I really wouldn't be surprised if we're halfway through the season, this Red Bull's not as competitive as they'd like to be, and they mail it in for the rest of the season. It would be risky because you have Max Verstappen on the team, but not doing so would also be risky because you have Max Verstappen on the team. And if this team looks at 2025 and says, we don't have a shot, but we might have a shot at 2026, I would not be surprised if that decision gets made sooner rather than later. But I think we will still see some good things out of this team. It's hard to imagine Max Verstappen going an entire season without winning a race. So I do think we're going to see him on the top step of a podium. It might be due to a crash. It might be due to rain. It might just be due to his brilliance. But I do think we're going to see him on the top step. But for the first time in a very long time, I think we're going to see Red Bull struggle in ways that we haven't seen. Started to see the past few years, but really haven't seen since their dominance began. All right, moving to the fourth place team from last year, Mercedes. For the first time since 2013, they enter a season without Lewis Hamilton as a driver. Can they get this car, though, back to a championship winning form? The team certainly seems optimistic about it, and that they've turned things around and taken necessary steps with the W16. Andrew Shovlin, the team's trackside engineer director, he said this year's car is a close cousin to last year's car. A little concerning if you're a Mercedes fan, just because of the problems that this car had last year with just finding the operating window, where some weekends they would look great, other weekends they would look terrible. So you would hope that those issues were corrected for this team going into 2025. But this is a team that just has struggled to adapt to the current regulation cycle that started back in 2022. And they're coming off a year where they finished the lowest they have in the Constructors' Championship standings since 2012. So the consistency is certainly a major issue that needs to be corrected into this year. But reports are they fixed that issue. And one thing that has changed is this is a more stable car, this is a more predictable car, and this is a more consistent car. So if all that is true, of course, a lot of teams, we see sandbagging, but we also see some overconfidence from teams. So again, time will tell with what we see on track from the Mercedes. But what we did see in preseason testing from this team wasn't so bad and did back up some of those consistency claims that they were making. George Russell also came out and said, hey, we've taken a much more disciplined approach to our development. We're trying to make sure that when we do bring in an upgrade and introduce an upgrade, it doesn't backfire on us like it did last year. And we're really doing our due diligence into making sure it's an upgrade that's going to work and going to improve the car. But with all of these comments, you can tell that the Mercedes camp is still a little bit cautious about their optimism behind this season. Could be some truth behind that. Could just be some past scarring from this team where they, coming off of 2021, there was that obviously intense battle between Max and Lewis for the championship. 2022 starts and they just dropped the ball, and they've been struggling ever since. So they came into that season, into the 2022 season, thinking they were still going to be competitive. They've gone into other seasons since then thinking, hey, we've got it figured out, and it just hasn't happened. So you have to wonder if some of that caution is just because of the past difficulties and them saying, hey, let's not overpromise, let's overdeliver with this car. One thing I am worried about with Mercedes, though, is the flexi-wing technical directive with the FIA. There's a lot of speculation that once this directive kicks in for the front wing specifically, it could bring back porpoising, which was something that plagued Mercedes in 2022. I mean, you'll never forget those shots. A lot of cars dealt with it, but mostly it was Mercedes just going down the straights at high speed, just bouncing up and down. So definitely something to watch with all of the cars, but especially Mercedes, because this is just a problem that affected them the most out of any of the teams. Will we see a step up from George Russell this year? For the probably the first time in his career, other than maybe towards the end of his Williams run, he is without a doubt the number one driver on a team and the number one driver on a competitive team. I don't think we're going to see any issues with George adapting to this role, and I think we're going to see a more confident George Russell. Now, of course, that confidence could turn into some mistakes, as we've seen in the past from him, but he's coming off a 3-year stretch where he was going up against arguably the greatest driver the sport has ever seen in the same machinery, and he held his own, and there were plenty of times that he came out on top. One of the most interesting things, I think, with George Russell and Lewis was in the 3 years they were together, Lewis had 697 championship points. George had 695. Really shows you how close these two were. And no matter how you feel about Lewis, of hey, maybe he has lost a little bit, he was still winning races during this time period. Of course, it took until last year before he won a race since 2021, but he was coming off that 2021 season, fighting for a championship, was still in good form. So definitely something that works in favor for George, and definitely something that helps with his confidence. And in that time period, too, he had the race win advantage over Lewis, which is definitely something to be proud about for him. But this is the moment George has been waiting for, and I think he's going to take every advantage of it, and take advantage of every opportunity this car gives him. Another thing, we touched on this earlier, George versus Max could get very interesting this season. Of course, this started back in Qatar last year with the impeding controversy. Max feeling like George threw him under the bus with the stewards. It turned into just a whole media frenzy, just a lot of drama involved there, with both the drivers saying they lost respect for each driver. I think, it seems like it's calmed down a little bit. I think this is going to boil over into this season. I think we're going to see some very tense moments between these two drivers, and I think we're probably going to see a crash or two between these two drivers. George, if this Mercedes is close to being competitive, but not all the way competitive, that's where we really see some bold moves from George Russell. And again, I think he's realized, hey, I'm tired of, he's said it in the media. I'm tired of being bullied by Max. I'm tired. Us drivers are tired of being bullied by Max. So I think we're going to see a lot of action behind those words from George Russell this year. I do expect George to win a few races this year, though. It might not be at the beginning of the season, but I think Mercedes will put themselves in a position where they're going to get lucky on a few weekends, whether it be with the setup, whether it be with bringing an upgrade when other teams are not bringing an upgrade. But I think they will have their moments. I don't know about Kimi. Don't know if he'll be able to win some races this year. We'll get into him in a second. But I do think, unless they really dive bomb this season, and things really go wrong, I do think we'll have some moments with George Russell back on the top step of the podium. But going to his teammate, Kimi Antonelli, probably one of the most anticipated starts to a Formula One career that we have seen. He comes with a lot of expectations, and he has massive shoes to fill following Lewis Hamilton's departure. Again, the most successful driver we've seen in the sport, but replacing, stepping into the shoes of one of the most impressive and successful driver team pairings that we've seen in the sport. So again, very, very big shoes for Kimi to fill, but all indications are he can do it, and he can step up to the plate and he can deliver. It might take some time, might not be this year, but the potential is there, and I think we're going to see some very special things from Kimi Antonelli. A good thing for him, Valtteri Bottas has returned to the team. He's the reserve driver for this year, but he's also been assigned as Kimi's mentor, which should be very beneficial with helping him with the setup of the car, navigating race weekends, navigating team members, getting his points across, learning how to have a voice within the team. I do think Valtteri will be a huge benefit for Kimi. And also, too, just maintaining and handling the highs and the lows of a season, and just maintaining a level head throughout all of that. What have we seen from Kimi Antonelli so far, though? Not much. He's 18 years old. He just hasn't raced a lot. He was in F2 last year. He finished 6th overall in the standings. Started out slow, but part of this was due to the team's struggles with the new regulations. Later in the season, ended up winning 2 races, finished 38 points ahead of his teammate, now Haas driver Ali Behrman. Um, Before that, he skipped F3, but before F2, he had won the Italian F4 Championship, ADAC F4 Championship, and Formula Regional European Championship. This guy's a winner. And you understand looking at his resume why Mercedes is so high on him, and why they see so much potential in him. Now, there's no doubt he's talented, but there are a lot of questions about whether this move happened too soon. A lot of that, of course, if Lewis Hamilton doesn't leave for Ferrari, I think we do see another year of Lewis on this team. We probably see Kimi enter the team at some point, maybe next year, maybe the year after. But I think a lot of this was spurred on by Lewis leaving. And also, too, and Toto, he'll admit this. He looks back at their opportunity to sign Max Verstappen as a mistake on the team's part because they didn't offer him an F1 seat. Red Bull did. That's why Max goes to Red Bull. Toto's always looked at that as, hey, if we would have offered Max a seat, he'd be a Mercedes driver. We'd have probably the best driver pairing on the grid. Toto didn't want to repeat that mistake with Kimi. And that was also a huge motivation between why Kimi was given the seat. Again, he had competed, worked his way up through the lower levels, but moving up this fast without the driving experience that you would expect someone like this to have, definitely a bold move for Mercedes to take. There is going to be pressure on him to produce results, but I don't think it will be immense pressure. I don't think Mercedes is going to necessarily expect Kimi to win some races this year. Might expect him to be on a few podiums, but they're going to be patient with him, and I think they're willing to go through a lot of the growing pains that are going to come with a rookie driver this young. And we saw a glimpse of this last year. Of course, Kimi in Monza, right before it's announced that he's going to have the Mercedes seat for next year, he goes out in FP1, he crashes. Toto immediately jumps on the radio and says, "All good, Kimi. All good, Kimi." Probably a terrible Toto Wolff impression, but it shows that he was right there saying, "Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. We're willing to work with you. We're willing to be patient." And I think we're going to see that a lot as we go out through the season, and we will see. Kimi. One thing you have learned from his driving style, watching him in Formula 2, watching him, go through the practice sessions. He's not afraid to push this car to the limit and see exactly how close he can get to that line. And I think that's part of what makes him such a great driver. We are going to see that from him. That's not going to change in his driving style. But with that, coming into Formula One season, the cars are bigger, the cars are more complex. There's just a lot more that goes into it. So there should be a learning curve where he's trying to figure out exactly where that limit is. And we're probably going to see some crashes from him this year. We're probably going to see some mistakes from him this year. But despite that, I do still think we're going to see some brilliant moments from Kimi Antonelli. Probably similar to what we saw from Oscar Piastri during his rookie season, where you did see him struggle at times. You did see the learning curve, but there were also moments. You'll always remember Oscar winning the sprint race in his rookie season. And other moments like that where you realize he's got it together. And the great Formula One drivers show it right away. It might not be Lewis Hamilton where they're all of a sudden right away getting podiums and race wins and it's an immediate success, but you will see glimpses of the brilliance right away with these drivers who are very special and have that just special talent in the rookie season. So, the car, it might not be at a championship level this year. I think it will be close at least. But George and possibly Kimi should at least be able to achieve podiums and maybe even race wins. But with Kimi, everything indicates if he's given the time and they're willing to be patient with him, he's going to be a special driver. And I know Mercedes fans are very excited, but a lot of other fans are very excited to see what this kid can do on track in a Formula One car. So again, overall, I expect Mercedes to be competitive. And if they can get it right, they're in a position and they have the tools and the resources where they could even shake some things up and catch up to McLaren, catch up to Ferrari, close that gap. I think they'll be ahead of Red Bull. But they do have if they're in the right position, they do have the resources and tools to really be able to compete for championships this year. All right, fifth place team from last year, Aston Martin. As excited as Ferrari fans are for Lewis Hamilton's arrival, Aston Martin fans are equally as excited for the arrival of Adrian Newey. A few other additions to Andy Cowell, managing director of Mercedes Powertrains, has come over. Enrico Cardile has come over from Ferrari, although this has been delayed thanks to Ferrari taking some legal action. But Newey is the headliner. And it's obvious when you look at his track record why this team is so excited about him coming into the team and designing the race cars. He's designed 12 championship winning cars since the 90s between his 10 years at Williams, McLaren, and Red Bull. What kind of impact can he have right away? Look at his resume. He came into Williams in 1991. In 1992 and 1993, they had a championship winning car. He goes to McLaren in 1997. In 1998 and 1999, McLaren has a championship winning car. He goes to Red Bull in 2006. By 2010, Red Bull has a championship winning car. Now, it's important to note that McLaren and Williams were still in a good spot and still competitive. They weren't at a championship level, but they were still competitive right before Adrian Newey's arrival for each of those teams. But Red Bull, they began F1 in 2005. Adrian Newey comes in the next year. So, it did take a little more time, but to take a team that was literally starting at the bottom and only had a year in Formula One, and within 4 years they're winning championships, shows how brilliant of a mind he has. And looking, it might take a few years with Aston Martin. They are at a very advantageous spot with the regulations changing next year, but you completely understand why this team is so excited about his arrival. Now, with him coming in, how much of the focus is going to be on this year's car opposed to how much of it is going to be focused on next year's car? It seems like the focus is on next year's car. It's interesting that Aston Martin has found themselves in this spot, because as surprising as it was to see McLaren's progress since the start of 2023, where they are at the bottom of the standings in the opening rounds, they're finishing 2024 at the top of the constructors' standings. As surprising as that was, it was equally as surprising to see the downfall of Aston Martin. 2 years ago, you would think Aston Martin would be in a great position going into the last year of regulations, but instead they're in this position where they're probably looking towards 2026. I think Adrian Newey will certainly have an impact on this team in this year's car, but I think most of that is going to come with the setup. I don't think he's really going to spend a lot of time, or the team is really going to spend a lot of resources either on upgrades for the season. And Aston Martin is known, they're not great at upgrading their cars throughout the season. In the midseason, they come out strong, they do a lot of work during the winter, but when it comes to in-season development, it's an area where this team really lacks. Now, of course, that's something that probably should change with the arrival of Adrian Newey, but the team has made some comments. Adrian Newey's made some comments. It seems very clear that the focus is on 2026, and they're probably willing to mail it in this year a little bit. But what will we see out of this year's car? Fernando said it's 90% different. We have, of course, seen the car. We've seen the car on track. We've seen renderings too, where we can really sit down and analyze what the changes are. Biggest changes to the side pod design: much deeper undercut to allow for more airflow. The front wing has been changed. The floor has been redesigned as far as we know. Some other changes to the front and rear brake ducts. So a lot of changes to this car, but again, most of this I think is just focused on improving the stability and predictability of the car, just so they can better manage it throughout the season. A good thing for Aston Martin, though, is they get to start using their new wind tunnel and simulator, which they've been working on for so long this season. Should pay off as the season progresses. But again, I think a lot of that focus is going to be, hey, we've got an opportunity to really maximize our potential. We have one of the most brilliant minds in Formula One history in our facility. Let's focus on the regulation changes. Let's get ahead for 2026 and really put ourselves in a very good position to compete. But at the end of the day, they still have Fernando Alonso on their team, who's a very special talent. But as we've seen plenty of times in his career, the level of engagement you see from Fernando Alonso is very dependent on the competitiveness of his car. Um, if the car is able to compete for podiums or race wins, he's all in. If it's at the bottom of the field, he's all out. So a lot of that will depend on what we see from the car. How close is it to those top four teams? How close is it to the midfield pact? Where exactly does this car fall? Again, I think it's probably pretty likely that it's, closer to the midfield than being a competitive car. So we might see more of a detached Fernando Alonso this year. But I think a major reason, he sees the potential in Adrian Newey. I think that's really the main reason why he's still racing, so late into his 40s is he sees Adrian Newey's arrival. He sees the potential for 2026. I think there's a very good chance 2026 is probably his last year in the sport. But he sees, hey, this might be my chance to finally win a race again. This might be my chance to compete for a championship again. There was some glimpses of it in 2023 before things really fell off. But again, I think Fernando, along with the team, his focus will really be on 2026. But if they can get this car to where it's, at a level where it's competing for podiums, I do think Fernando will see a true effort from him. And he'll be able to extract everything he can out of this car like the special drivers can do. But again, I think the much more likely scenario is that we see a repeat of last year where this team is meddling around the midfield, kind of separated from those top four teams and just trying to find their place in the midfield. The other side of the garage, Lance Stroll. Will he make any progress closing the gap with Fernando? You look at their head-to-head results, it's concerning. And you understand why a lot of people look at Lance Stroll's position with this team and look at his father as the person running the team, and you kind of put two and two together and think, all right, if his dad wasn't there, would he be in this sport right now? Because 2023, when they had a very competitive car, when Fernando was winning, achieving podiums and competing for race wins, although he didn't break through and actually win a race, he finishes the season 206 points. Lance has 74. Last season, of course, we saw a dip in the performance of the Aston Martin, but Fernando still finishes with 70 championship points. Lance only finishes with 24. There is a stark difference between these two drivers. In his time with Aston Martin, he's accumulated 8 podiums. Lance hasn't had a single podium. It's a bad situation for Lance, and it's surprising considering he didn't look like the special talent that we see, but he saw success early on in his career that would make you think he could be a good driver. He had a P3 finish in the 8th race of his career. In 2020, he had 2 other podiums, which was his 4th season in Formula One, but since the start of 2021, he's only finished P6 or higher 8 times in 89 races. Very concerning for Lance Stroll. And you look at him and you see his attitude, and I think that's probably what the most concerning thing is. He just looks like he's not having fun. He looks like he doesn't want to do this. He looks like he wants to be, there were the rumors of him leaving F1 to go pursue a career in tennis. He likes snowboarding. He has other interests like cycling. You just wonder, is he really in it? Or is he just doing this because his dad runs the team and it's, he gets paid a lot of money and he might as well. But he just, as each season goes on, he seems more and more detached. And it's concerning. And, I'm not saying there are any expectations that he would be at Fernando's level or should be at Fernando's level, but Lance is supposed to be in the prime of his career right now. Fernando's 43 years old, and there's still this much of a difference between their performances. But again, it is what it is. His dad runs the team. And, I don't know if that's a situation where it's taken all the pressure off of him to perform, or if it's a situation, like I said, where he's just lost his interest. But I don't see anything that tells me that we're going to see a different Lance Stroll in 2025. So again, with Aston Martin, things are looking good for the future. I just don't think the future starts this year. I think the future starts in 2026, and we might see this team as a true contender starting there. But this year, this is probably going to be a team that's meddling around the midfield in trying to find their place in the midfield. Moving to probably who will be a close competitor for Aston Martin, Alpine. Can this team continue their upward trend that they started last year? If you don't remember, they ended the season on a very strong note in the final 4 races. Double podium for Ocon and Gasly in Brazil, P5 and P7 for Pierre P5 and P7 for Pierre in Qatar and Abu Dhabi, respectively. Very, very strong end to the season. And you have to credit some of this to the arrival of Flavio Briatore. Who is he if you're not familiar? Another character in the Formula One world. He's been in F1 since the late 80s. He's won drivers and constructors championships with Michael Schumacher and Fernando Alonso. Very successful career, but also had some very ugly and controversial moments. He was infamously banned from the sport after the Crashgate saga at the 2008 Singapore Grand Prix. Has been reinstated, is back in the sport now. So there is controversy that comes with him, but you have to understand at the end of the day, he knows F1, he knows how to run a championship team, and he knows what he's doing with this type of stuff. So again, he's been introduced as the executive advisor last June, immediately started making changes, and you've seen his impact. He is without a doubt the voice of this team, running this team, making the decisions for this team, and really pushing this team towards success. Now, could we see a repeat from Alpine in the same way that we saw improvements from McLaren last season, starting in 2023? Probably not, just because of the time constraints with the regulation changes. At a certain point, Alpine is going to have to turn to 2026. They're not going to have a full season to really try to upgrade this car and maximize this car like you've seen in other years in the middle of the regulations. They are keeping the same chassis from last year's car in an effort to save some of the budget for the 2026 development, which should tell you a lot. That really the focus is on 2026. This is something that should pay off for them in the long run, moving towards those new regulations, but they're definitely sacrificing this year doing that. But despite this, Briatore, he still has a goal for the team to finish in the top 6 and fight for podiums. Could be a lofty goal, but we have seen improvements from this team. And we've seen surprises both at the end of the season, but also too in preseason testing, where there were simulations that they ran and tests that they ran where you could tell this team has made improvements and it has pace that it didn't have last year. But how much can they improve, and how much will they pour into this year's car opposed to looking at next year's car? Again, I think the focus is going to be on 2026 in trying to maximize those new regulations. And this has been backed up too by Pierre Gasly. He even said he's on board with that too, and he would allocate everything to 2026 if it was up to him. Another thing too that will lead to that focus being turned towards 2026, they're switching engine providers. They've used the Renault engine for so long. They're switching to Mercedes, which should pay off based on what we're hearing from the Mercedes engines. It looks like those engines are in the best spot, at least right now, for the 2026 regulation changes. But Alpine is making that switch, and there are a lot of changes that come with that switch and a lot of preparation that comes with that switch. So definitely another thing that kind of makes you think 2025 is going to be a mail-in year for Alpine. But for Pierre Gasly, what could this season look like? Probably similar to last year. He'll have some good moments. He'll have some not so good moments. We should see a more relaxed and comfortable Gasly this year. It was no secret that he and Ocon had a very testy relationship. They played it off well in the media, but there were moments where it came out. And they had a history before they were teammates. Now that Ocon is gone, you have Jack Doohan coming in, a rookie. Pierre is without a doubt the number one. There's no issue at all with that. So we should see a more relaxed and a more comfortable Pierre Gasly. Will that lead to better race results? A lot of that will be dependent on the car. But you would think a more comfortable driver should be in a better position to maximize what they can out of the car. His teammate, though, Jack Doohan, could be a very different season for him. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Flavio Briatore, he can be very similar to Helmut Marko in the way that he makes comments and will put pressure on drivers to succeed and makes it seem like their seat is incredibly hot. Um, we saw one race at the end of the season from Jack Doohan. That's it. And already Flavio has made comments to make you think Jack might be out the door. So basically, a recap of the timeline. Esteban Ocon announces in June he's leaving the team. The team announces Jack Doohan as the second driver in August of 2024. A few weeks later, Williams makes the change to Franco Colapinto. He makes his debut. He impresses a lot of people with his performances, even Red Bull to a certain extent. And there are rumors, that he's going to sign with Red Bull. He had some late season crashes that I think scared Red Bull away. He ends up signing with Alpine as a reserve driver. This gets announced in January 2025, but the very interesting part about this, Franco signed a 5-year deal as a reserve driver. That doesn't happen. You see a 1-year deal, you maybe see a 2-year deal. 5 years is a very, very long commitment for a reserve driver. That makes you think he might not be a reserve driver. So this comes out. It raises a lot of questions. Obviously, a very surprising move for them, considering they had just signed, Doohan to a contract. Now it's coming out that Doohan's contract only guarantees him a certain number of races for the start of 2025. I've seen as low as 4. I've seen up to 6. I've seen comments made that no, it's actually more than 6. It's very clear, though, that it's not a full season guarantee for Jack Doohan. And I think they brought in Colapinto. I think what happened is they signed Jack Doohan, not realizing Colapinto was, an option for them and would be as successful as he was with Williams. They signed Doohan. They immediately regret it when they start seeing Franco. And signing Franco as a reserve driver basically helps minimize some of that damage caused by signing Jack. But I think if it was a situation where they don't sign Jack, they hold it off, Franco comes out, he performs the way he does, they're going to Franco right away. And Jack Doohan doesn't even get a seat and doesn't even get a contract. So, it looks like that's probably the situation. You have to feel for Jack Doohan, though. This is a guy who he's patiently worked his way up the ranks. He's been a reserve driver and a test driver for this team. He's done things the right way. He finally gets his opportunity, and before he even starts his full first F1 season, there are already rumors that he's out the door and he's going to be replaced. It's just, again, the contract length for Franco Colapinto is something that you have to look at and say, this means something. This isn't just a regular reserve driver contract. And Briatore's made some comments, too, that have kind of added some fuel to the fire. Before Colapinto was even signed, he came out and said a driver will be changed if a driver is not making progress and not producing results. He's called Colapinto one of the most important assets for the team. He has these expectations for top six finishes and podiums, which is probably unrealistic. But if that's what he expects, that's putting a lot of pressure on Doohan to come in, figure out this car, and not only figure this car out, but compete in the top 6, compete for podiums. When you have McLaren so far ahead, Ferrari so far ahead, Mercedes so far ahead, Red Bull so far ahead, it's a very, very tall order for Jack Doohan. And, another thing to note is there's no secret that Franco Colapinto brings a lot of South American sponsorships with him, which can go a very long way in this sport when it comes to, there's just so much money on the line. There's so much money that goes into funding these teams and being able to make sure they have a competitive race car, that type of stuff can go a very, very long way. You hear about those sponsorships with Colapinto. You don't really hear about those sponsorships with Jack Doohan. And apparently these two drivers, their performances have already been compared in preseason testing. So, the team is already, analyzing the two performances, trying to judge their ability to drive this car. And again, it sucks for Jack Doohan, but it really seems like he probably won't make it, past the midpoint of the season before Franco Colapinto comes in and takes his seat. But what have we seen from the two drivers so far between Jack Doohan and Franco Colapinto? Um, Jack, he's had one F1 race, and that was Abu Dhabi last year. Finished P15. He was a lap down, but Gasly finishes P7, so definitely underperformed in what you would expect from this car. Before his time in Formula One, he spent 2021 through 2023 in F2, won 6 races, 11 podiums. Before that, he spent 2020 and 2021 in F3, had 4 race wins, 7 podiums. Franco Colapinto, you go to his resume, he obviously has a lot more experience in Formula One. He had 9 races last year, comes in to replace Logan Sargent, finishes P8 in Baku, P10 in Austin, really maximized and outperformed the Williams he was driving, which made him so valuable, and made a lot of people look at him and say he's something special. He did finish the season on a sour note, though, was a little bit reckless, had 3 DNFs in his last 4 races, so definitely something that it looks like scared Red Bull away, but would be concerning for any team looking at his performances. He did spend some time in F2 in 2023 and 2024, had 1 race win, 3 podiums in 20 races, spent 2022 and 2023 in F3, won 4 races, had 10 podiums. So, Colapinto, he has the edge with the F1 experience, but the results favor Doohan at the lower levels. So definitely something to watch. But again, I think, all indications are if Jack Doohan doesn't produce the results that Flavio Briatore wants and expects from this team early on, he's not going to last long. And it's a cutthroat business, but it's all about results. And there's just a lot of money on the line with these teams, both with performances and with sponsorships too. And you have to feel for Doohan, but it's unfortunately a story that we've seen plenty of times before, and a story we'll probably see happen again. This team, though, you expect them to make a few strides based on what we've seen, but again, the focus should be on 2026, and this will probably be a team that's meddling around the midfield. I expect them to be on the higher end of the midfield, but I don't expect them to meet those expectations and achieve podiums, achieve top 6 finishes. I think this is a team that's probably going to be struggling on the fringes of the points, and trying to get a point or two at certain races. But things are looking good for this team. And Flavio, you have seen his impact. And if this is a situation where it's Pierre and Franco Colapinto going forward, it's still going to be a good spot for this team as they head into the 2026 regulations. All right, finishing up with the bottom 4 teams, starting with Haas. For the first time in a long time, things started heading in the right direction for this team last year. They scored more points in 2024 than they did throughout 2020 through 2023 combined. And for the first time in the team's history, they're profitable, which means they're able to rely solely on their sponsorships and prize money to fund this team and fund this season, opposed to in the past when they've had to basically solicit funds from their team owner, team founder, Gene Haas. So a huge game changer for this team. And it received a lot of criticism in the moment. Gunther Steiner was a very popular figure. Everybody loved him as the team principal. But the move from Gunther to Ayo Komatsu definitely looks like the right move. A huge payoff is the team's partnership with Toyota, which is allowing them to build a simulator for their first time. You'd have to imagine that Komatsu's role, or played a pivotal role in securing that partnership. They've been borrowing Ferrari simulator in Maranello, which creates obvious issues for a team that's based in the United Kingdom. Komatsu came out and said they only use the simulator 10 to 15 days out of the year, which is just insane to think about. That a Formula One team wouldn't have their own simulator, but would only be using their rival, or I guess, they have a partnership with Ferrari, but still only using a simulator 10 to 15 days out of the year. It makes complete sense why this team has struggled so long. But Komatsu's also done some internal restructuring that's helped get the team in this position. And the team was actually pretty successful in their in-season development last year, which is a rare occurrence when you look back at their past. The news that the team is finally self-sufficient means they likely won't have to hold back on any of the development going into this year and should be able to take full advantage of the cost cap, which is another, complete game changer for this team. Adds a little bit of pressure too. But not only will it allow for further development, but it should give the team the opportunity to expand their team personnel, which is a huge need for this team. They have one of the smallest team outfits out of all the Formula One teams. There's still room to grow, but things are definitely headed in the right direction for Haas. So what are we going to see this year from the 2025 edition of the Haas? We've gotten a glimpse through preseason testing, through the reveal, through some other leaked photographs, but the most notable change is the front wing. The end plates look like they have more of a slanted backside, which should help with the car's aero, at least that's the belief. The side pods have been changed a little bit. There's more of an overbite inlet, which we have seen with some other cars, more of a gap underneath the side pod, which again, we see that with a lot of cars now. The end plate on the rear wing has been changed, similar to the design we see on the Ferrari, where it has more of an edge to it. So very interested to see how that'll pay off for them, if that'll be an efficient rear wing, and kind of where they fall in the field of the 10 teams with their rear wing. But time will tell how well these design changes will work. A new addition to the team that should help their performance is the arrival of Esteban Ocon. We should see him outperform the car like we saw with Nico Hülkenberg last year. Replacing Hülkenberg's performance will be a tall order, but if anybody's prepared to meet that, it should be Esteban Ocon, or at least he should be in the class of drivers who should be able to meet that. But Haas seem to be doing everything they can to make him comfortable with how he likes the car set up. They've, reports that they've rearranged his steering wheel, they've adapted the power units to his liking, so they're definitely taking his input and his experience and taking that into consideration and really listening to him. I don't think the focus this year will necessarily be on Ocon's results, but his role this year will, I think, with the team is to provide his experience with the car setups and the development and act as a mentor for his teammate Ollie Bearman, who's entering his first full season as a Formula One driver. Ocon's backed this up with his comments too. He's taking a time will tell approach to the season and doesn't want to place any targets yet. And it's really clear that this is a team that's going to be focused more on 2026, if anything, and trying to gain an advantage over the top teams who are going to be more focused on this year. Ocon, though, he has made comments. He sees the team heading in the right direction, and he agrees with the trajectory that they're taking. Another cool part of Ocon's side of the garage is the addition of Laura Mueller as his race engineer, which will make her the first female race engineer in Formula One history. So pretty cool little tidbit there from Haas. The other side of the garage, though, Ollie Bearman. Entering his first full season, we saw a glimpse of him last year in the Ferrari and in the Haas. He's been impressive, but looking at his results, last year he had a P7 in Saudi Arabia. Well, he was driving the Ferrari, of course, for Carlos Sainz. He jumps in the Haas, though, finishes P10 in Baku, finishes P12 in Brazil. So you've seen results from him, and you've seen him be able to adapt right away to these cars, which is something a lot of drivers struggle with. So definitely a good sign from Ollie Bearman. Looking back at the lower levels, he spent last season as Kimi Antonelli's teammate in Formula 2, spent 2 seasons at that level, won 7 race wins, 9 podiums, so very good track record there. 2021, he spent in F3, 1 race win, 8 podiums. So again, Ollie Bearman, very, very talented driver, has put together the results, and you can understand why Haas is excited about the addition of him to the team. There will be some growing pains with him, though. Like every rookie driver, you have to expect that. But what we saw from him, it can't be ignored. He, does have the advantage of those 3 races from last year, so he's not a traditional rookie like we'll see with Gabriel Bortoleto, even Kimi Antonelli. Some of the other drivers who just are jumping straight into the car for the first time, Isaac Hadjar as well. So that'll pay off for Ollie. The biggest question with him, though, is how will he handle a 24-race calendar of full-length Formula One races? For anyone not familiar, Formula 2, the lower series, the races aren't as long. And Ollie, when he jumped into, I think it was the Ferrari in Saudi Arabia, made some comments about he was struggling. He got to that midpoint of the race, and, that's what his body was accustomed to, and everything after that he really had to fight for. So that'll be a big thing for him this season is just learning how to manage the season, learning how to train his body and condition his body to be able to race a 24 race calendar, but also the length of these races as well. But again, with this team, I don't expect the focus to be on 2025. The focus will be on 2026 and building that momentum that they started last year and continuing to build that towards 2026. And this car looks like it's in a good spot to produce those results. They'll be in the midfield. I wouldn't expect Haas to be, you know, surprising us with any results, with any podiums or anything like that, unless there is, a complete out of the ordinary chaotic race, rain, whatever the case may be. But if everything is status quo, you'd expect Haas to be in the midfield. But things are certainly headed in the right direction for this team. We probably will see a pretty big difference between Ocon and Bierman just because of the experience. But I do think we're going to see some moments from Ollie Bierman where, the same as Oscar Piastri, Kimi Antonelli, just those moments with rookies or younger drivers early in their career where they do something special and you realize the type of talent they truly have. But again, Haas is in a very good spot. Just have to be a little more patient, but things are definitely headed in the right direction for this team. Moving down to VCARB, Visa Cash App Racing Bulls, whatever they want to call themselves nowadays. Could this be Yuki Tsunoda's last year with this team? Christian Horner's kind of made it sound like it is. Question if it makes sense for the team to keep him past this year and saying you can't have a driver on the support team for 5 years. Interesting comments because it sounds like Red Bull shareholders have some say in this kind of stuff, as we've seen in the past, especially with the decision of what to do with Checo, who's going to replace him. Does Daniel Ricciardo stay on the team? It seems like the shareholders want to go young, and they definitely do have the influence, at least with this team. It looks like Yuki tried to leave at the end of last year for another midfield team, but Red Bull activated an option in his contract to block it, which is unfortunate for him because a lot of those teams that were interested in him don't have that seat availability moving forward. Last year was a very unique year where there were a lot of seats open. There was a lot of movement that could be done. Now these teams, specifically the teams that were looking at Yuki, those seats are taken. And that availability is not there anymore. So you have to wonder what exactly is going to happen to Yuki Tsunoda after this year. He is talented. Of course, he can be pretty angry and have a temper sometimes, but the talent is there, and you would think that some team will pick him up. It's just all about which team is that going to be? Who will have the seat available for Yuki if it comes to that? But if he does put things together at VCARB, and Lawson really struggles at the senior team, could we see a midseason swap between these two drivers? Certainly not something that Red Bull hasn't done before. There are a lot of people that feel like Yuki deserved that seat over Liam anyways. We'll never truly know how tight it was, but they did take a while to announce that. Announce the Red Bull promotion for Liam Lawson. And Yuki looked pretty strong at points last year despite not having that great of a car. He had 7 points finishes, accounted for almost 2/3 of his team's points, and he's really outperformed to every teammate that they've paired him with other than Pierre Gasly. You would think it'll probably be the same with Isaac Hadjar too. And moving to his side of the garage, what should we expect from Hadjar? He looked, we'll get into F175 a little later on, but he looked pretty scared being in the spotlights, and you get it. He's 20 years old. He's, all of a sudden in the spotlight of an F1 team for the first time, the bright lights, the glamour, everything that comes with it. So that'll be something to look towards is what kind of confidence will he have in a race car on the track? And how long, if he doesn't have that right away, how long will it take for that to build? What do we know about Isaac Hadjar, though? Looking at his resume, 2023 through 2024, he spent an F2, took home 5 race wins, 10 podiums. He's coming off a brutal second place finish in the Drivers' Championship with Gabriel Bortoleto. He's the two of them are battling all season long. They go into the final race of the season. Basically, Hadjar can win the championship if he wins the race, and he stalls at the start and ruins his chances. And Bortoleto goes on and takes home the F2 championship. So a brutal finish for him. But you have to wonder, is it in the past for him? Is that going to carry over into this year? Will that affect any of his confidence? So another thing to keep an eye on a little bit there. Before F2, he spent 2022 in F3, 3 race wins, 5 podiums. He's done a few practice runs, free practice runs at the Formula One level. And of course, this, free practice, you look at those results and take it with a grain of salt. But 2023, Mexico City, he was in an AlphaTauri, finished P17 in that session. 2023 in Abu Dhabi, he was in a Red Bull, finished P17 in that session. 2024 in Silverstone, in a Red Bull, finished P19. In 2024 in Abu Dhabi, in a Red Bull, finished P15. Did the postseason test last year and did have a faster pace than Yuki. But it looks like there will be a pretty steep learning curve for him this year. And what we've seen from him outside of the lower ranks, what we've seen out of him in a Formula One car, really hasn't been incredibly impressive. So again, we know how the Red Bull teams can be. You would think that him being a rookie, having the potential he has, being a 21-year-old driver or 20-year-old driver, and being at the junior team, he would be given some leeway in some patience, but you never know with Red Bull. It can be a very quick decision with this team if you're not performing. It will be a tough transition for him, because of the race pace, but, he should be able to get a hold of this car at some point throughout the season, though. It's the V car, RB Racing Bull, whatever you want to call it. They did produce some results at the end of last year and really took a step up towards the end of last year. So if they continue that trend, and they've taken some things from last year's Red Bull car as well, so that should help them a little bit, or at least improve their performance based on last year. So there will be the opportunity for Isaac to get this together. He just needs some more experience. But what will the car look like for this year? First off, we know it's going to be beautiful. The livery that they unveiled, that white livery is just, it's incredible. Definitely the best looking car on the grid. But their collaboration with Red Bull continues as well. Last year, they moved their facilities to Milton Keynes to be closer to the main team. And this year, like I said, this year's car will be a lot more similar to last year's Red Bull. They switched the RB20's rear suspension and drivetrain, and that will continue as the foundation for this year's car. And they also switched to Red Bull side pods and front suspension from last year too. So again, the Red Bull had its own struggles, so you have to watch out for that. The Red Bull of last year. But compared to where the V-Carb was last year, it should be a step up for this team and should give them a boost in performance. The aim is to finish atop of the midfield, but it will be interesting to see if these changes pay off. I do expect to see a decent season from Yuki Tsunoda. I think he's going to be very motivated to produce results, not only to prove himself to this team, but to set him up for a potential move in the offseason next year. Not that he won't work out, but I think it will be a tough season for Isaac Hadjar. He's young, he's inexperienced, he could have trouble with the car if last year's Red Bull problems carry over to this car. But I do like him at least to start figuring things out towards the end of the season. We expect Yuki to produce, but a lot of where this team ends up in the constructor standings at the end of the season is going to depend on Hadjar's side of the garage. So definitely something to look out for with them. Going to Williams, another team that is very eager to start the season. Very clear, though, that the focus is on 2026. James Vowles has said it numerous times that since he took over as the team principal, that 2024, 2025, they'll be sacrificed so the team can get their facilities in order, get their resources in order, and really take advantage of the regulation changes and putting the team in a spot to compete when that time happens. And they're making progress. You've seen incredible changes through this team and incredible improvement through this team. And there's a lot of optimism, too, for 2026 because Williams uses the Mercedes engine. And this will, they're still using it now. This will continue to the new regulations, but that is another thing that should help them get a jump start on other teams for next year. But for the context of this year, it's also important to remember this is a team that's still recovering from the crash damage that they sustained last year. They had $14.5 million in damage costs last year. Second highest team was Red Bull with 6.5 million. Ferrari had 5.1 million. Everyone else was under 5 million. Huge deficit in damage costs compared to the other teams. And that's something that I expect Williams to still have to, they're still going to feel the effects of that, at least for the start of the season. It got pretty scary for them at the end of last season where crashes would happen and they didn't know if they were going to be able to race two cars in a race at times. So it's, again, a big thing for this team to overcome. But they're getting there. They're making progress. They're on the right direction. Changes to this year's car, though, not a whole lot. The front wing is probably the biggest difference. They've gone with a design similar to most teams where the nose area dips down a little bit compared to last year and years before. They've kept the shark inlets on the side pods to reduce the size slightly, and the side pods have also changed a little bit in shape. Engine covers changed a little bit in shape. They've changed the rear suspension too to basically mirror what Mercedes has. Other than that, though, not a whole lot of changes. But I do expect this car to be an improvement. This is a team that's building. This is a team that's focused. And now that they have Carlos Sainz, this is a team that's driven. And they have a goal at the end of the day. It might not be this year, it might not be next year, but they have a goal and they're working towards it. And it definitely looks like they're making progress. Carlos Sainz, I believe, will bring a huge boost to this team. You know, he's filling the seat that was occupied by Logan Sargent and Franco Colapinto. So there should at least be less crashes from his side of the garage and less damage costs. But he should help significantly with just helping to understand or helping the team understand how to better set up the car on race weekends. You'd also expect he'd have some impact on the car's development, but that probably won't be felt until next year just because the resources are mainly going to go towards next year and not necessarily this year. So probably we'll see a little bit of that, but not as much as we'll see in the years to come. It's going to be a tough year for Sainz, though, and his fans. The last time Carlos Sainz went a full season without achieving a podium finish was 2018. And it's hard to imagine him continuing that streak this year. Now, with that being said, we have seen some promising things from preseason testing from the Williams. Their race pace was very good. Not a lot of tire degradation. So two things that should put them in a very good spot and should give them a little bit of boost. But how much will they gain from that? But again, going back to Sainz, it could be a possibility, but I'd be pretty shocked to see him achieving a podium at some point this year. I would love to see it. Especially a team with the history that Williams has, and that has, of course, fallen off the way that Williams has to get back to that level, competing for podiums. You would love to see it. I just think we're going to probably have to be a little more patient before we see that. But Carlos Sainz, I think he'll extract everything he can out of this car, and I would not be surprised to see him fighting around those final points positions on a consistent basis. The other side of the garage, though, Alex Albon. My question for him is, how is he going to be viewed at the end of the season? Because for the first time since he left Red Bull at the end of 2020, he won't be viewed as the team's number one driver. Now, I think Sainz will help with his growth as a driver. Sainz was very beneficial to Leclerc as a teammate at Ferrari. He was very beneficial to Lando as a teammate at McLaren. I think that'll continue. He's a very, he gets along with everybody. He works well with everybody. Of course, he has some moments. Every driver has some moments where they don't want to give, the advantage to their teammate. But I do think we will see some improvement from Albon just from having Carlos Sainz as a teammate. But you have to wonder that if there is a large gap between the two of them, how soon do we start hearing questions about Albon's seat? And especially if this team has such high expectations for 2026 and beyond. It's hard to compare the two drivers because they've been in completely different cars when they've been on track together. Personally, I don't think the gap will be large enough to start those conversations. Albon's a good driver, and he's very comfortable with Williams. He's been there a long time now. He's going into his fourth season. And as good as Sainz is, he will come down to earth with this Williams. And it's, again, it's very unlikely that we'll see him competing for podiums and certainly not competing for race wins this year. So could bring his confidence down a little bit and kind of bring him back to earth a little bit. Last year was a dip in performance for Albon, though, compared to 2023, but a lot of that had to do with the budget concerns, with all the crashes, mostly by his teammates, and of course, their inability to develop the car because of those damage costs. It could be a tough season for him, for Albon, though, to get into the points. You have to think those top four teams, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, barring anything crazy, are probably going to take the top 8 spots in the points. So that leaves 2 spots, P9 and P10, for all the midfield teams to fight for. So it'll be a very, very competitive season between those midfield teams, to get those 2 spots. And then looking at this team specifically, if the Williams isn't a good spot for that, you'd have to give the advantage to Carlos Sainz, you would think, to at least finish ahead of Albon. So really for Albon, we could see a lot of races where he's got one shot to get 1 point, championship point, per race. So could be a tough season for him. Could see him struggle a little bit compared to usual, but again, Williams is headed in the right direction, so they at least have that working in their favor. And the good news for Alex too is the team's expectations are not great for this year, and they're patiently waiting for next year to arrive. He's been there 3 years. He knows the team. He's produced results for the team. So that should put any criticism he might have to rest, at least for this season. So again, with Williams, you expect them in the midfield. I do expect them to finish higher than 9th, like they did last year. But again, I think it's going to be another team that mails it in for 2025, and their focus is really on 2026. All right, the final team, Stake F1 Team Kick Sauber, whatever they're called now. Completely new driver lineup for this year. One very experienced driver, one making his F1 debut. Nico Hülkenberg, can he push the limits of this car like he did with the Haas last year? He returns to this team, actually raced for them in 2013, comes over from Haas and has a much more difficult task ahead of him compared to what he's been used to in the future. It's clear that the move likely was influenced by his German ties, with Audi taking over this team next year, and just the sponsorships that can come with that, and of course just Audi wanting to have a German driver. And he's even admitted that this season will be a building year for the team as they make that transition to Audi. But he's also said the car is stronger than he's expected. After the postseason test in Abu Dhabi, he walked away, of course, thinking that he would be in a much worse spot. So a little surprise there. I do think we'll see, a few good things from Hülkenberg. The biggest struggle is the performance of this car. Was the bottom of the field last year. Probably will be at the bottom of the field again this year. So can Hülkenberg be patient enough to make it to 2026 and be there when Audi takes over, and hopefully this team is in a much better spot for those regulations. His teammate, though, Gabriel Bortoleto, coming out of a very strong F2 season, again, battled all season with Isaac Hadjar, came down to the final race. Hadjar stalls out. He wins the championship. So a lot of hype coming with Gabriel Bortoleto for this season. First Brazilian we will see on the grid since Pietro Fittipaldi in 2020. But what have we seen from him in the past? Of course, again, he won the F2 Drivers' Championship last season, had 2 overall race wins, 8 podiums. He won the F3 Drivers' Championship as well in 2023, had 2 race wins and 6 podiums. He's only 20 years old, too. Very young, very talented, and has produced results. And you see this with the endorsements he's gotten from a lot of the top drivers. Max Verstappen has spoken fondly of him. Fernando Alonso has endorsed him too. So when names like that are behind you, it definitely gives you a boost of confidence, and it probably helps the team. Gives them confidence as well that they made the right decision signing him. We just haven't seen him in an F1 car yet. There will be some tough moments because that is a transition. Now, he's proven he can make that transition pretty easily from F3 to F2. F2 to F1 is a different story. I do think there will be a learning curve with him, and there will be some tough moments, but I think he'll figure it out probably faster than a lot of the other rookies. Even being in a car that's probably lower than most of those other rookie drivers, I do think we'll see some things from Bortoleto we'll see his brilliance start to shine through. But even if the talent is there with him, you have to wonder how much of a chance is he actually going to get to be successful with this car. It's hard to break through and get an F1 seat, so you don't blame him for taking it, especially with the prospects of Audi taking over. Audi has been very successful in almost every racing series they've competed in. You have to think they're going to figure this out when they come into Formula One, but it could take time, especially with the engines changing. They'll be their own engine supplier too, so another mountain to climb for the team. But you do have to worry. Hopefully Gabriel made the right decision coming to this team. We've seen it plenty of times before, where drivers come into a lower level team. That lower level team just can't produce and can't give that driver the car they need, and then other teams look at that driver and they're just not producing the results, and they think that driver just doesn't have the talent, and then that's the last we see of them. I don't think that'll happen with him. I think he'll shine through. I think even if he's at the bottom, we will see moments where you realize he's a special driver, and he'll do enough to get a better seat if he needs one, and if this team stays towards the bottom. New additions to management with this team, the return of Mattia Binotto last year as Chief Operating Officer and Chief Technical Officer. Good to see him back in the sport. I know it's not new for this season, but still a little new as he came in last year. So good to see him, back in charge of a team and trying to lead a team in the right direction. Jonathan Wheatley also comes over from Red Bull and starts as the team principal in April. So also interesting to see what kind of effect he'll have on the team. We haven't seen much of the car yet, but it's clear the focus is going to be on 2026 and beyond. Of course, we've seen it on track. We've seen it at the reveal, but you just can't get a lot from that there, and not what Stake, F1, Sauber, whatever you want to call them. Not what they did in preseason testing really revealed a lot. So still a lot to be seen with this team. And we'll probably just have to wait, until the opening rounds to see really where they lie in the whole scheme of things. But they are making efforts to improve things. Of course, Audi's coming in starting next year. The team plans to build a technical center in the United Kingdom that should come with the addition of 300 employees. So another good thing from there. There have been some concerning reports, though, with Audi's engine being the worst on the grid, and it is concerning if you're on this team, because so much has been looking towards 2026 and saying that's when Audi takes over. That's when we're going to turn things around. So definitely something to watch as the season progresses and kind of where the engine development lies with these different manufacturers. From a performance standpoint, though, for this season, I wouldn't expect much from this team. There is some hope. Last season's upgrades that the team brought to Vegas did save them from a scoreless season, and there is a belief that they can build off those upgrades, going into the season. But the end of the season also is a time where a lot of those teams, by that point, they've stopped developing their cars. So, this is a team that might have just struck when the iron was hot, and caught other teams, not off guard, but just brought upgrades when other teams didn't bring upgrades. And that could be a reason why we saw those results last year. But realistically, compared to the other team's developments, there's a good chance this team finds itself back towards the bottom of the standings at the end of the season. So could be a long season for them, but there's always the hope of 2026. All right, wanted to do a quick review of F175 Live. Obviously, we're a few weeks out from that now, but thought it was a good kickoff to start the season. And understand the traditional fan might have liked the old format better, where each team does their own reveal and, you can kind of track it piece by piece. But this is the new Formula One. It's all about the glitz, the glamour, the TV time, selling tickets, making money. It's a worldwide industry that has more reach than any other sport other than probably soccer. So if it means more attention, more TV time, more ticket sales, they're going to do it. And you really can't blame the sport for doing it. And I thought, hey, if you didn't like it, don't watch it. Go on Twitter afterwards, or x.com, and, just look at the posts and look at the pictures of the cars. Didn't know that much about Jack Whitehall going into it. Thought he was a good host. thought he had some funny moments. I liked his opening monologue. Had some good jokes. Went straight to the George Russell Max Verstappen beef, which was great. Also had a pretty good jab at George Russell with the whole train. Francis Bourgeois, I think that's his name on TikTok. Never realized how similar they look, but that was a good one too. Valtteri Bottas saying he was Joe Exotic. That reference was pretty good too. So good host. And overall, I thought it was a good show. They had some celebrities there too. I thought they did a good job going table to table, getting some interviews from some of the drivers, keeping it a little mixed up. Maybe a little bit too much on the light show, maybe a little bit too much on the DJs. But again, it's the new age of Formula One. They want the shows. We got Vegas on the calendar for a reason. So it's just what they like to do now. But really what this night was about, especially for the fans, was seeing the new, or recycled, liveries for the cars this year. So what I wanted to do is just go through 1 through 10, give you guys my rankings of each of them based on just their overall appearance. Number 1, V-Carb. Just an incredible livery that brings you back to the white Red Bull that we saw back in Turkey in 2021. Really, really nice touch with the mini blue bulls on the rear of the car. I also like the yellow nose and airbox with the Red Bull logo. Just a very, very good look. I think everybody agrees on this. And really looking at where they could have gone, I can't imagine a car being designed in a better way with this specific team and color scheme. So A++ V-Carb, number 1, without a doubt. Number 2, might be a little surprising for some people, I've got Red Bull. I know it's literally the 10th straight year that we've seen the same livery from them, but there's a reason why they never change it. The navy looks great. Like the V-Carb, they have the yellow nose and the airbox with Red Bull. All of it just working together. It looks like a race car. It looks really good. And yeah, I know it's, disappointing every year we see this car and realize it hasn't changed. But overall, in the grand scheme of things, I've got Red Bull at number 2. Number 3, Aston Martin. Like Red Bull, not a lot of changes here with the livery. They did change the airbox, the side, is the airbox from white or to white, and the side pods have more black on them now. So a few changes there, but overall, pretty much the same car that we've seen from them. But the Aston Martin green always looks great on a car. And it's always going to have a sleek look. It's always going to kind of give you some James Bond 007, vibes to it. So, just a good look, traditional look for them, but a very good look. And that's why I have them at number 3. Number 4, Mercedes. Like Aston Martin, just a few changes from last year's car, but not anything really significant. A little more silver on the car than last year. They changed the airbox to silver instead of red, which looked like it was probably a sponsorship change there. Good look for Mercedes. Classic look for Mercedes, but didn't really blow you away like you see with some of the other cars. But again, it's a look that they've gone with for a long time. Of course, they tweak it a little bit here and there, but keeping it consistent can be a good thing. So that's why I have Mercedes at number 4. Number 5, Ferrari. I struggled with this one. The Ferrari red will always be an iconic look. It's what you think of when you think of Formula One. And they did change the red to a darker shade for this year's car. I think it still looks fine and it still works. That's not the concerning change to me. The real issue is the white HP stripe and logo on the engine cover. We've seen HP logos in other sports that are black and white, so it's confusing to me why Ferrari has to use the blue that just doesn't go with this team. But just the blockiness of the white stripe, it just throws it off. If it was a little HP logo or something else that was a little more subtle on the car, probably be a much different story and they'd be higher on the rankings. But that white stripe just, I don't want to say ruins the car for me, but it brings them down to 5 on this list for me. Number 6, McLaren. Literally the exact same car as last year. Seemed purposeful for them. They had so much success with last year, didn't want to change it too much. It is a good look. It's a unique look. There was a slight change where there's some blue on the side mirrors for their new sponsorship with Allwyn. And it, again, the papaya, it's very unique. It sticks out on the grid. I don't hate it. I just don't think it's the best look compared to the others. Kind of seems a little pieced together at parts. Um, but again, not a terrible look. I wouldn't say they have an ugly car, just maybe not as great as the others. Number 7 on the list, Williams. Improvement from last year's livery for sure. Pretty similar, but a few subtle changes, more sleek look with the darker nose. One thing I'm always going to love about this car, as long as they keep it and keep the sponsorship, is the Duracell airbox that they've made look like a battery. I think that's probably one of the best sponsorships we've seen on a car in maybe ever. Definitely up there in contention for the best ever. But a similar look to what we saw last year, just a little bit darker. Pretty good look, but not a whole lot of changes, and that's why I put them at number 7. Number 8, Sauber, Kick F1, whatever they are now. Much better look than last year. I do like the faded transition from the green to black instead of the blocky look from last year. But they revealed this at F175 Live, and it looked very, a smooth transition from green to black. We saw it in preseason testing. It didn't look smooth anymore. So I wonder exactly what this car will look like when we see it for the first time on track in Australia, at least, first time for a race. It also hit me too watching this, the branding opportunity Nico Hulkenberg has, with his Hulk nickname and having a green car. So again, enjoy that for a year while you can before it switches to Audi, because they're not keeping the green, but maybe something for him to take advantage. But again, some improvements from last year's car, but still not entirely great. As a kid who grew up in the United States in the 90s and early 2000s, I guess it was more so the 90s for this, but it just reminds me of Nickelodeon and Slime Time Live, or whatever those shows were called. So, again, could be better, but have made some improvements, but I've got them at number 8. Number 9, Haas. Didn't really love it. Pretty similar design to last year's. They just switched some colors around. Most notably was the switch from the white side pods, or excuse me, switch to white side pods from the black side pods from last year. It probably makes the car pop a little more, but the black nose almost makes it look like the car's wearing one of the cooling vests that the drivers wear before the races. Just didn't like it too much. Didn't like it. Just doesn't seems pieced together. Doesn't seem smooth. Maybe a little better than last year, but don't love it. And that's why I've got them at number 9. Number 10, Alpine. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. This team's known for having a blue car and a pink car, and it looks like they just cut those two cars in half and slapped them together and said, this is our one car for the year. The pink BWT on the side pods is just blocky and ugly, and the car just, it looks like cotton candy. I saw it online. It really looks like cotton candy. And it is a struggle, having pink and blue as your primary colors, but at the end of the day, who made that decision? They did. And they have, produced cars that look a lot better than this, but it is, without a doubt, in my mind, the ugliest car on the grid this year. All right, finishing up with a few quick thoughts on some headlines that have been circulating the Formula One world. Is Monaco fixed? We got an announcement that they are moving to a mandatory 2-stop race. Look, I've gone back and forth with Monaco a lot over the past 4 years. It is still the crown jewel in the Formula One calendar. It is beautiful scenery, the history, the tradition, the glamour, all the money that's in that city and that comes into that city and that country for the race. It is just a spectacle. But the racing has not been great. And the biggest reason is the cars they're too big now. It's the circuit has not changed at all, other than a few minor changes, but the width has not changed. But the cars have gotten much, much wider. And because of that, you just can't pass. There's one maybe opportunity on the straight, but you hardly ever see cars pass in Monaco. So they had to do something, because it really came down to, you would watch this race and, you You'd watch qualifying, you'd see what the qualifying results were, and that was pretty much the race. You would always tune in on Sunday, but you knew if there was no rain, if there were no crashes, if there was nothing crazy that happened, this was going to be a procession around Monaco for 78 laps. So 2 stops, I think, is probably the best fix for this, and they had to do something. I don't think you could take Monaco off the calendar. It would be, just the sport wouldn't feel the same without that race. They have moved it a little bit. I think they moved it a week back, so it's not Memorial Day weekend for us at the United States, at least, which will be a little different. But you can't get rid of the race, I don't think. So this was probably the best opportunity to mix things up and the best result they could come up with. And I think it'll work. I think, depending, we'll see. For the first time, there will be this 2-stop mandatory strategy. So a lot of the teams will be experimenting this year. They won't say they're experimenting, but they don't have previous races to go off of saying, okay, this is the best strategy to go this long on the mediums, this long on the hards, or vice versa, or whatever the case may be. They're going to have to figure this out on the fly. So I think that'll be very interesting. Now, of course, hopefully we don't get a rainy race, because if we get a rainy race, I don't think this 2-stop, mandatory 2-stop ordeal comes into play. But again, I think, if anything, this was probably the best change that they could make to make Monaco a little more interesting. This one's a little bit old. Not entirely old, but it's been a few weeks. Could Max Verstappen leave Red Bull and go to Aston Martin? You would think no, but this is a sport where you wake up one day in February and you realize Lewis Hamilton's going to Ferrari. We've seen other blockbuster just moves come out of nowhere that nobody saw coming. In this one, there's a little bit of writing on the wall. Now, of course, we know about Max's, displeasure with Red Bull last year at certain points, not thinking the team was going in the right direction, making mistakes with the setup, with, basically the progression of the car. A lot of people have left Red Bull, though, and there have been a lot of comments made by Max, made by his dad, that there are key people leaving, and that means something. And I don't think, there are some times when his dad will say things, and I think he's just trying to say something. I think there's a little bit of weight to this. And we saw, from the most recent Drive to Survive season that came out, it looks like there was a little bit to the Max to Mercedes stuff. Now, of course, it didn't happen, but it looked like that was at least entertained by Verstappen. Now, looking at Aston Martin, Max has said, okay, I'm going to stay with Red Bull at least through 2026. I think that's very important in a very telling timeline, because he's giving them this year. He's giving them the first year of the regulations, but there's an expectation that Aston Martin's going to get the new regulation cycle right. So this gives Max the opportunity to be loyal to Red Bull right now, wait to see how 2026 plays out, see how competitive Red Bull is, see how competitive Aston Martin is. And if Aston Martin's in a better spot, I would not be surprised at Max going over there. And you have to look, too, at his other interests. He's made it very clear he wants to race another racing series. He doesn't want to do Formula One for the rest of his career. And one of those that he wants to do is endurance racing. He's shown interest in the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Of course, we see his sim racing. He's always doing those endurance racing challenges or races, so it's something that he's very interested in. Red Bull doesn't have a team in the WEC. Aston Martin does now. This could give Max the opportunity to sign on with Red Bull. Maybe he signs a longer contract. Maybe the terms of the contract say, hey, give us 2 or 3 years in Formula One, then we'll let you do whatever you want to do. You want to do endurance racing, that's fine. You want to do whatever else, that's fine. We'll help you figure it out. Adrian Newey is over there now. These two had a very good working relationship. They have a lot of respect for each other. They've had a lot of success with each other. A huge, huge component that Aston Martin has that Max Verstappen is familiar with. So again, it seems hard to imagine him in the racing suit, the green racing suit for Aston Martin. It could happen. And especially if, of course, if Lance Stroll, keeps if he still wants to race, he's going to race as long as his dad's, in charge of the team. But Fernando Alonso isn't going to race forever. And you would probably look at 2026 as maybe that's his final year. And maybe he leaves at the end of that season, and maybe that opens the door for Max to make the jump. So again, crazy to imagine, but when you really think about it, there could be something there. Last thing I want to touch on, the driver swearing, driver conduct fiasco between the FIA and all of the drivers. Um, Look, I get both sides of it. The drivers, they're in a very tough spot. We're broadcasting their radio messages, and showing their true emotion in the heat of battle. Of course, they're going to be angry. We cuss people out when we're on the road in the middle of a city, driving our car 45 miles an hour. So, of course, these drivers going 200 miles an hour with the competitive nature that they have and everything on the line and all the money and prestige and everything, of course, it's going to be hard for them to hold their language. But you do understand the FIA side of it too, as to, hey guys, outside of that, when you're doing the interviews, post qualifying, pre race, post race, whatever the case may be, in the media pen, can you just watch your language a little bit? You've been given an opportunity to kind of cool down a little bit, calm down from the race. Kids are watching. Can we just kind of try to keep it clean? You understand that. Um, what has been said, though, is, they're going to pull the radio messages from the race, which I think would be a complete mistake for them to do. Because it's something that a lot of people enjoy seeing on the broadcast, and it adds a lot of character to the race. Where something happens on track, the first thing that your mind goes to is, I wonder how the driver reacted to that. I wonder what their radio message is going to be. Are they going to be pissed? Are they going to be okay with it? What exactly, do they have to say about this? And it gives you the real-time reaction, opposed to getting out of the car, having a chance to cool down, watching the film, maybe talking to their PR guy, realizing, hey, this is the answer you need to give. It just gives us a true and honest side to the driver's perspective in these races. What I don't understand, though, the fix seems so easy. And we've done it with the F1 Kids broadcast. Just have two broadcasts. You've got one that's the traditional one, where we play the radio messages and they're bleeped out, and we still get that. And if fans like that, they can focus on that and watch that feed. If you got kids next to you and you don't want them hearing the bleeping and you don't want them hearing any cussing or what sounds like cussing, you've got an alternate feed. And that one's G or PG rated or whatever it is. And I just don't understand why that can't be the solution to this. And just having two broadcasts. We've seen it in other sports. It works out great. It's more TV time, more commercial time. You get an audience for both. So I really don't understand, why that isn't a solution for the FIA if this is really a concern. But one thing I'm very interested to see as the season progresses is, they've said that they're going to penalize or could penalize drivers for swearing, for misconduct. I think the term they used was for moral injury. That whole aspect of it is just ridiculous. And you'd have to imagine if it's going to affect anybody, it's probably going to affect Max Verstappen. Yuki Tsunoda too. I doubt he'll be in a spot where he's competing for championship points that matter that much. But could you imagine if Max gets penalized and gets points taken away because of it? He can't stop swearing during the race or in a post race interview. That would be highly controversial. But you also wonder, how far does this go with him? What steps are the FIA willing to take to control the driver's conduct in their language? And you also have to wonder, coming out of the F175 Live, if you didn't watch, they put Christian Horner on the stage, the British crowd boos him. They put Max Verstappen on the stage, the British crowd boos him. And then the FIA basically releases a statement condemning the fans for this. Will they start trying to control the fan behavior too, and the fan conduct more than they have in the past? So definitely something to watch out for. I understand not wanting to have the swearing on the broadcast. If you've got kids watching, the solution seems easy to me. Kids broadcast, regular broadcast, separate it. Easy as that. But everything else that's coming with it, with possibly penalizing drivers and possibly coming down on fans too, it's ridiculous. And I hope this comes to a resolution sooner rather than later. And honestly, I hope that the FIA backs off from their stance on this. All right, that will do it for today's pod. Appreciate everyone for watching, listening. If you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify, please like, subscribe. Any of that helps. I will be back with another episode probably on Saturday after qualifying. Give a little recap of what we've seen so far in the free practice sessions and qualifying, a little race preview as well. And then I'll be back on Sunday after the race with a recap of what we saw in Melbourne. Again, thank you to everyone for tuning in. Till next time.